Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. For this week's video, I would like to present another layout design. This is for an O-scale layout, that is O-scale 2-rail. And before you get too excited, no, this is not a photograph of the finished layout. This photograph is just a teaser for another project that I recently finished and which will be presented later on this year. Now, the site that I had available to work with was rather small for O-scale. It was of a size which would be far more appropriate for N-scale. Initially, the space I was given to work with was only about 11 by 14, which really is not enough room for the sort of layout the customer wanted. He wanted to run large locomotives with long trains on a double-track main line, and he was hoping for a yard and an engine terminal as well as some nice scenery to run through. And clearly that was not going to work in the space that he had available, not without adopting N-scale. Anyway, after some discussion, I managed to convince the client to let go of the double track main and accept a single track loop with a scenic run along one side and as much of a yard as I could get in along the other. So this is what I drew for him. And although this one is labelled Plan 1, it was not my first attempt to get a workable layout into the confines of the space available. What I've done here is put a basic loop in using as large a radius curve as I can possibly fit, except in the fact that most of the turnouts are going to need to be curved. And we'd already discussed turnouts. I'm going to build them from fast tracks jigs and modify them to curve them as necessary. I didn't realize until recently that fast tracks don't currently offer curved turnout jigs in O-scale, so they're going to have to be customized. Anyway, looking at the left side of the plan, you can see I have a backdrop down there, and the intention is that this side will be placed against his garage door with room to walk around three sides. Originally, he wanted to be able to walk around all four sides, but that would have meant that the railroad had to be even shorter, which would pretty much have left us with just a circle. Now, when I presented this first drawing to the client, I was actually quite surprised. He was very receptive to it and said there were a lot of features that he liked, despite the fact that he wasn't able to get his double track main line in. He did ask about connecting up the yard lead to the team track to make a second loop. And indeed, on this plan, it does look as though that might work until you consider how the yard will be used. And really, at that point, it no longer works. Although this plan is the best that I could come up with in the space available, based on what the customer wanted, there are still some huge shortcomings with it. And at this point, I asked the customer to send me photographs of his garage taken from all four corners. And when I had a look at them, it did appear that there was plenty of room to extend the railroad further into one corner of the garage, just by rearranging some of the stuff that he had hanging on the walls. This is what I drew next. The basic plan is more or less as it was before, except that I flipped it upside down and I have removed the team track in favour of a larger yard capacity, and I've added a curved turnout behind the backdrop to a 4-track staging yard along the side wall of the garage. And although the plan is now almost 5 feet wider, it doesn't take up significantly more space because this R-way would already have been needed to walk around the previous plan and gain access to all sides. So the only additional width required is the 18 inches or so for the staging yard. And it is now possible to operate it in a reasonably prototypical fashion. Trains can be made up in staging, run through the scenic area and into the yard, which we're now going to operate as a terminal by ignoring the connection back out to the main line. Although there's no reason why he can't make multiple loops before stopping there, just to give the impression of distance run. And although this particular plan was not pursued any further, I was thinking that we could cut another curved turnout at this end and put a couple of spurs in this corner. I was thinking of maybe a team track and a second track running off the benchwork edge with some kind of cassette system supported on the front of the staging yard to form a working interchange. And that would have gone a long way towards providing enough car spots at this town to justify as a branch terminal, if one accepts the fact that the engine terminal and the large locomotives would not be particularly appropriate for such a small branch. But anyway, as I mentioned just now, this plan was not pursued. The client really wanted to be able to walk all the way around the railroad. And at this point he decided to clear out the far end of the garage, which was being used as a wood shop, thus providing an open space in the middle, something like 22 feet by 14. So this red rectangle now represents the space available. As you can see, it's not quite wide enough to have a staging yard out at the side, while still maintaining a reasonable curve radius. So we went back to the core layout, just expanding it to fit the space. So now that there was a little more space available, we decided to once again look at the possibility of double track or something akin to it. This is one of the variations that I drew. It's not a true double. It's instead two independent single track loops, one of them running through the scenic section and the other through a staging yard in the middle, with the yard facilities and engine terminal along the front. There are several problems with incorporating a double track main line into a tight space. One is that the double width roadbed makes the sharp curves look even worse than they would be with single track. And secondly, it really doesn't look right with short trains, because a prototype railroad would only ever build a double track if a single track would not be able to handle the anticipated amount of traffic. So as I said, this is a version with two independent single track loops. And here is a modification of it with a twice round single track, giving a much longer run. I've still got the scenic run along the outside, the staging yard in the middle, and a visible yard with engine terminal in the front. This is another variation where instead we're going to go with visible staging, make it look as much like a real yard as possible, and put the engine facilities there, and now add a small town in front. This plan works quite well for the client because one of the other things on his want list was a small town. So we decided to develop this plan and see where it would go. Here is the first version with all the track drawn in. This plan has been flipped left to right, and I don't actually remember the reason for doing so. It was eventually flipped back again. We can see that I have the staging yard with 4 through tracks and 3 stub tracks, along with some engine servicing facilities. And I've tried to lay it out as much as possible like a real engine terminal, rather than just squeezing in as much storage as possible. Because as I said earlier, the plan is to have this area fully scenic and make it look as much like a real yard as possible. I put in 3 spurs, one for a team track behind the depot, one for a grain elevator building. These 2 structures, he showed me photographs of those in the small town that he grew up in, that he would like to duplicate as close as possible. And I suggested a fuel dealer in the space on the other side of the track, because that's one of the few industries that actually makes good use of the sloping ground down to the low level track that runs in front of it, and which we cannot get rid of. For most industries, that amount of drop off in that distance would be difficult to work in, but with a fuel dealer and a coal trestle, it's actually an advantage. Well, the first thing the client said about this plan is that he wanted it flipped the other way around, because this part of the engine terminal would actually look very close to a photograph that he had taken of a yard near where he lived. Here is the plan with the engine terminal the other way around, with the garden tracks in the right location for him. And here is another version of the plan flipped the other way, because sometimes plans look different depending on which side you approach them from. And of course, being in the middle of the room with the ability to walk all the way around it, he gets the choice of which way around it's assembled, and therefore which direction he approaches from. That was the reason for presenting one printed the other way around. Here is that same plan with a little more detail drawn in. I've also corrected the proportions of the engine terminal using the size of roundhouse that he already had in his possession. It took quite a lot of back and forth emails, but eventually we managed to get the track spacing and angle exactly right to fit what he had before. You'll notice that it's now further from the turntable. And we've gone with a 28-inch turntable. representing just over 100 feet in O scale, because he wanted it to be long enough for a nickel plate Berkshire. He has two of them in his possession, and he really wanted to display them on the garden tracks beside the roundhouse, per the photograph that he took in his youth. I've also managed to find room for a proper coal delivery track and a shorter spur serving the ash plant. We are seriously short of length here. The turntable approach tracks are only long enough to park one locomotive on, and really they should be at least 3 locomotives long. And also the lead track for the coal delivery is only long enough for a switcher and a single coal hopper. So I wanted to play around with it some more, see if I could make some adjustments and improve it somewhat. And the client also asked if the grain elevator and the depot could be switched. So here is one plan with switching those two structures. I've now got the spurs going one each way. It doesn't really work that well because in order to get enough clearance from the team track, it means the depot is now opposite the turnout instead of on the passing siding, which is not the best arrangement. So in this version, I've turned both spurs round. The curve into the team track is now sharper than I originally had for my minimum radius, but it doesn't matter since it's only a switching spur. His large locomotives don't have to be able to make it. And it also puts the main lines closer together at this point, which is why I suggest a retaining wall there. On this version, I rearranged this area, switched the two turnouts around, which had the slight benefit of giving a slightly longer passing siding. I've also rearranged the turnouts in this area, getting about an extra foot, or in O scale, 1 extra car length, or 3 of the 4 through tracks. And by swapping the order of the turnouts in this location, I was able to get slightly long turntable approach tracks and a tail track long enough for a small switcher and 2 bay hoppers to serve the coal delivery spur. Here is that same design with the scenery suggestions drawn in. I've also copied the roof lines of the grain elevator complex that he sent me a photograph of, as near as I can get it for just a single photograph. And I've shown the team track as just rails in the gravel. Apparently that was the way it was in the town that he wanted to represent. We have a road passing under the passing siding and a grade crossing on the low level main line. Now all along the client had been humming and hawing about the fuel dealer since there wasn't one in the town that he grew up in. It was further out of town, and he was asking about what other kind of industries could go here. We also talked about bumping out the benchwork to give a slightly larger area of scenery here and put a church in it, because there was a church fairly close to the railroad in the town of his youth. Here is that adjustment. Also, this plan shows the driveway around the garden tracks, more or less duplicating the photograph that he showed me, although there's not room to have all 3 tracks same length, so only 2 of them are long enough for his Berkshires. We had to cut the corner off, otherwise the aisle would have been too narrow at this point. Here is another version with a different kind of industry in this location. I'm assuming that it's a multi-story building with the truck loading dock in the basement and the rail loading dock on the floor above. The other way of doing that would be to have the driveway ramp up and a retaining wall the other side of it, as I've drawn here. The difference is very subtle, and also in these later plans I've squeezed one additional short stub track into the yard to be a useful place for parking a few cabooses. Anyway, that is just about all for this design. However, it may not be the last time you see it, because at the moment I am negotiating with the client to build it for him. So keep your fingers crossed, because I would very much like to be able to present you with an O-scale layout build in the not too distant future. And with that, I will just say bye for now. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again next week.